today. It is, for me, truly a pleasure to commemorate a generation of people who stood up for our values in the face of evil and allowed us to be together here as Europeans today, in an undivided Europe. We live in democracies, we cherish our freedoms, and being free from persecution, prejudice, fear and discrimination seems the normality, which it wasn't. It's not the normality. It's something veterans fought for. It's something our fathers and grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers fought for. And if, the survivors of that would have been here today, I would have liked to thank them on behalf of all those who followed after them here in Europe. They made unimaginable sacrifices. They suffered incomprehensible tragedies. They faced dangers that most of us today hopefully will never know. And they went through an emotional roller coaster, which must be at the very boundaries of what the soul can bear. In those years, we didn't know, or we didn't talk about PTSS, shell shock perhaps, but especially people weren't encouraged to admit to that. So we need to pay tribute to them whenever we can. Looking back, when facts, figures and stories are nicely ordered, it is difficult to realize how desperate the situation then was and how it really could have gone the other way. I recommend everyone reading or watching The Darkest Hour by Anthony McCartan. I mean, it is a remarkable film. If you don't want to read the book, go and see the movie. It's really worth your while. The need for remembrance, I think, is greater than ever, and I'm really encouraged by what you were saying, that many young people now join that feeling. We see slipping away from living memory, simply because a generation who lived through the 1930s and the war are gradually leaving us. We're arriving now at a turning point in history where living memory is substituted by written history. Distance in time has the same effect as distance in space. The events disappear from view. Suffering is felt less acutely, and budding threats are perceived less keenly. There are those that say that young Europeans don't care for war stories and reminiscences, and who say that these dark times have passed and can't return and we should stop remembering. But read the first line of the Schuman Declaration of 1950, and I quote, "World peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it." End of quote. This then is the origin, the original raison d'être of European integration. Once there is no one around to recount their real life experiences, there is of course a danger that people will leave the history books on the shelf to gather dust, because, we've heard it once again, we know it. Quite often in these discussions with people, stop talking about that, we know by now. I'm not so sure. There is a danger in this for all of us, because how do we progress together as a society, as a people, if we tell ourselves we know it, we have heard it before? Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I think this is a very important lesson. If we go look for parallels in history, very often we say, it's not the same because they don't wear uniforms, or they don't have this, or they don't have that. But look beyond that. Look at what is underneath that, if you really want to see where the history rhymes. It's part of human nature. It's part of human nature to love, but it's also part of human nature to hate. It's part of human nature to be happy, but it's also part of human nature to fear. And fear leads to hatred, and hatred leads to dehumanizing others, and that leads to conflict, exclusion, and war. So to be aware of our time, to understand what is going on, we need to read, we need to listen, we need to remember. If possible, yes, even relive and think about what happened to our parents grandparents and how they got caught up in this European tragedy. One of the best ways, my two youngest children are now 13 and 11, one of the best ways for them to understand how close it was is to take them around the town where we live, Heerlen, in Limburg, in the Netherlands, and to just go for a walk at places where there are stolpersteinen, where you see where Jewish co-citizens were removed from their homes and killed. Nothing drives home the point more to my kids than seeing that. So they lived in this house, yes. So what did they do? They went to school. Oh, and how did they work? Well, he was a butcher, or he did this and he did that. And their children were what age? Your age. And they were taken away and gassed, yes. That is something, that is how you can recount and make it something people can understand. The Liberation Route Europe Foundation is doing important work in retelling their stories, our story. I hope you agree that the idea of reliving your darkest hours in the fields, forests and streets is of huge and lasting value, just as with the Stolpersteinen to see where the soldiers went in 44 and 45, to go there and experience that is of huge importance. To understand the reality of the wars that were fought in Europe, the rest of us need to understand where these veterans stood. Breathe the air they breathed. Cast their eyes along the horizon. Feel the ground under our feet and hear the sounds around us. You can do this in many, many places in Europe. On the beaches in Normandy, in Arnhem, in Buchenwald, you can do it in Nijmegen. And then imagine these soldiers under fire crossing in small boats the river, which is really quite a massive river there. Imagine the plight of the Polish soldiers at Driel when they had to help rescue English soldiers who needed to cross the Rhine with English boats. And then when the last English soldiers were helped crossing the Rhine, they didn't send the boat backs to pick up the Poles. Things like that we need to remember, not just the heroics, but also the bad behavior and the tragedies. But let us also imagine the enormous sense of gratitude of our parents and grandparents once they were liberated. I still talk to my parents about this. My father would now probably would not have survived. He was very skinny and ill in 44 because that's when he was liberated in Breda, and he was liberated by Polish soldiers who then stayed in the house with my grandparents and who said they would once come back once they had liberated Poland. And just imagine the tragedy that they themselves, probably in their lives, when they went back to Poland, most of them were imprisoned or sent away, and many of them didn't even get to go back to Poland, live their lives in other European countries, in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom and elsewhere. But where I wouldn't be standing here if they hadn't liberated Breda. You know, these are things that we should be aware of. And I can tell you that my parents are certainly grateful. My mother was liberated by American soldiers in Europe. Something to think about for a minute. One can lose freedom. One can lose the fundamental values of democracy, rule of law, human rights. Nothing is irreversible, not then, not now. My political father was a man called Max van der Stoel. He was 16 years old when the World War broke out. He lived in Leiden with his mother. His father was a general practitioner, a doctor in Voorschoten. And when the invasion started on the 10th of May, they didn't know what to do, and he, with his mother, went to her parents who lived in Rijnsburg, which is not far from Leiden. He should have stayed in Leiden, but they tried. And Max always told me he saw paratroopers coming down from airplanes on Valkenburg airfield. And he said, for the rest of my life, I will remember the feeling as a boy, 16 years old, of soldiers from another country just stepping into my country and taking away my freedom. From one day to the other, we were no longer masters of our own destiny. It just can happen like that. And all his political life, he fought for that never to recur. And he also fought in other countries for those countries to be free of that as well. There are countless stories we can tell. I'm going to tell you a couple of more stories because I believe through stories we can really evoke the human side of the great tragedy which was the Second World War. Let me share first with you the story of a young boy called Daddy Zak. I saw his picture a few years ago in a museum in Warsaw. You were there on the state visit in Warsaw. Daddy caught my eye because there's a picture of a young boy who looked just like my youngest son Max looked at the time. Blue eyes, blonde hair, and the happy and open face of a child excited to discover the world that was still in front of him. But Daddy was Jewish, was born 69 years earlier than my son Max, and he lived in wartime Amsterdam. For these two young Dutch boys, Daddy and Max, life could not be more different. But what brought them even closer together in my mind was a Dutch tradition which I observed in Daddy's photograph. The metal name tags around his neck with his name and address. The idea that your kids would run off and play outside and that the stranger would help them find their way back if they were to get lost. A tradition that many people in the Netherlands still follow today. And our kids wore the same things. But poor Daddy and his name tags did not find their way home to that address in Uiterwaardenstraat in Amsterdam. He was rounded up with his parents in 1943, sent to the Vught concentration camp, from there transferred to Westerbork to Sobibor, killed on the same day his parents and he arrived, on the same day they were gassed. The only memory we have now of Daddy is that name tag from around his neck, dug up in Sobibor, and the photo that goes with it that is now in the museum in Warsaw. I'm still pleading with the Polish authorities to please give the name tag, the original, back to Liska, to his family. They don't want to do it now for historic reasons. I understand that, but I still appeal for human reasons to please give it back to his family. For Daddy's life to mean something, it is important that his story lives on. That I tell the story, and some of you will remember it, some of you will tell it to others. You know, I can't tell you how much importance I attach to these stories. I think we all need a huge debt of gratitude to Steven Spielberg, who registered all these stories of Shoah survivors, so that we see it and re-see it, and I hope one day I can create, with the help of Steven Spielberg, a film we can make with these testimonies, and perhaps we can then spread them around in the educational systems of our member states, so that they have this in schools. Nothing tells a story better than a personal account, I believe. Well, the second person I want to tell you about is a man called Leo Lichten. Leo was one of the heroic liberators of Europe. Leo was born in New York, in Manhattan, but he lived in Brooklyn at the time. He was a private first class in the 84th Infantry Division of the US Army, known as the Rail Splitters. He died on the 20th of November 1944, just a few miles from my family's home. I told you we live in Heerlen. He died in Prümern near Geilenkirchen, where the Americans met some staunch SS resistance, because the SS were trying to protect the railway that they needed for their provisions. He was a kid of great talent, a kid brought up in poverty, but he was so smart. I'll come back to a moment. He now lies alongside 8,000 of his brothers in arms at the Netherlands American Cemetery and Memorial in Margraten, in my home province of Limburg. All the American war graves in that cemetery have been adopted, mostly by local people. There's even a waiting list, frankly. And we all take care of the upkeep of the graves. I was allowed to adopt Leo's grave, and I decided that I would go in search of more information about him. We, the Dutch, we feel a very strong bond with our liberators, even now after so many generations have passed. And I wanted to write about this bond and pay tribute to the people that formed it. I had been trying for many, many months to learn more about Leo from official records and through friends and acquaintances in New York who tried to help me find his family. I had uncovered details, but enough to put together some articles and publish them on some American veterans' websites. So I knew a little about Leo. I even learned more about the way he died in that final battle on the 20th of November 1944 in the diary of one of his colleagues that I was sent later. Very brutal diary, brutal details. But I still couldn't say that I had built a true bond with Leo, the person, the man, the boy, because he was 19 years old. A letter arrived from the United States. 86-year-old Paul Slater had written to the Dutch embassy in Washington after reading a veterans magazine with a speech that I had given at the Margraten Cemetery in 2009, where I mentioned Leo. Paul and Leo had been childhood friends. So I found Paul's phone number, I just called him. And we talked non-stop for hours about Leo, about Paul, and their bond of friendship. Talking about Leo was difficult for Paul, who still held on to the anger created over 16 years earlier by the way in which Leo and other boys like him were sent totally unprepared to their deaths in Europe. I need to perhaps explain, if you have a bit of patience with me, why. Leo was talented but poor. So there was a program in the US where very talented but poor kids, boys, were sent to colleges sponsored by the military, a very special program. Then what happened when the Americans joined the Second World War, there was a huge shortage of soldiers because they hadn't invested in that over many, many years. And there was also some jealousy that some kids would be drafted and others would be allowed to stay in college. So abruptly, they decided to end that program. And all these kids were sent from college straight to military training in Louisiana, but very brief military training. One of them was Leo. Another one of them, also a Jewish boy who had come from Germany, was Henry Kissinger, who had exactly the same, they were on the same train, they were on the same boat to Europe. But Henry was luckier, and I've spoken now several times with him about this. He's very emotional when you talk about this. Henry was luckier because he knew German so well, he knew the situation so well that officers saw that. And the commanding general of the unit said, I want him to explain how my men should behave in Germany. And then the commander said, I want him to be my driver. And then, because he was very smart, they said, we want him to work in the intelligence service. And he was put in charge later in Germany of managing a whole city. But he also said to me, had they not discovered my talent, my knowledge of it, because he'd only come from Germany, I think, 8 years before that. Had they not discovered that, my fate would have been exactly the same as Leo's, because we were totally unprepared for this. And actually, Leo died the first time he was put into action. And he knew he was going to die because the last letter he wrote, he said, I'm not going to survive this, but it's for a good cause. And the veterans, the real soldiers in the unit, knew that these kids had no chance. And the percentage of deaths of these college kids was much, much higher than other soldiers during the war. So that's just to explain why Paul was so angry. Paul went into the Navy, served on the Atlantic routes, but did not experience the same thing as Leo did. I then invited Paul to come to the Netherlands. Paul has had, because sadly he died a couple of months ago, but Paul has a son and a daughter. And it was not a surprise to me that his son was also called Leo. So I had the honor to invite Paul and his son Leo to the Netherlands in October 2010. And almost 66 years after Leo fell in battle, we stood together on a hill overlooking the battlefield at Prümern, a few miles from my home across the German border. We even found a farmer in the neighborhood who could tell us what happened on those nights because he was there. We took Paul and Leo to Leo's grave in Margraten, where he spoke to his late friend about the life he had gone on to lead, fulfilling the dreams that they had discussed as young boys in Brooklyn before the war. And I saw an 86-year-old man becoming a 19-year-old kid again, and he was talking to another 19-year-old kid who was lying in that grave. Paul told Leo about the opportunities that he and his children had had in life as a direct result of the values they had defended and fought for all those years ago. And I wanted to recount it here because I took them exactly on what you're proposing. I took them to Bastogne. I took them along the route where, because the soldiers of the 84th were in Gulpen before they were sent to Germany. I took them there. I took them along the route where they went. So reliving this route for Paul was extremely important. Anyway, Daddy and Leo were both just boys. You know, if you have children, you just imagine. My oldest children are now 10 years older than Leo was when he was killed for our freedom. These boys were dehumanized and murdered by the purveyors of an evil ideology. They both teach us lessons about our past. When we talk about the war, it seems natural to focus on the victims and imagine that they were just like you and me. We're all victims. We're all so lucky that we've escaped that. We're also lucky to live in a time where we cannot become victims of such evil. Do not think that it was only the victims who were just like you and me. It was the perpetrators too. It is important that we ask ourselves, what led ordinary men and women to follow these evil leaders? What allowed these evil leaders to come to power? How did their poisonous ideology go unchallenged? We had Holocaust Memorial Day just a couple of days ago, and there was a film shown in Beaux-Arts. I was there by testimony of a Polish, Jewish, Belgian lady who had survived Auschwitz, who had even been used as an interpreter by Mengele. And the one image that stuck in my mind when she was recounting all these horrors, at some point she said, yes, and then we had a whole big batch of Hungarian Jews coming in, and they were out of Zyklon B. So they tossed the children alive into the ovens, and we could hear their screams all over the camp. And so many years later, she broke down, recounting it. And this woman was a survivor. She survived everything. So, and then you ask yourselves, to what point can you push human beings to take a child, an innocent child, and throw them into an oven? What has happened to us? Because it's us, it's human beings, it's fellow Europeans who did that. That we could stoop that low. Some of you will be, I hope, familiar with the work of a writer I admire a lot, called Joseph Roth. While many historians of the Nazi era histories are written with hindsight, Joseph Roth was writing in the 1930s before the worst occurred. And while he didn't live to see the Nazi terror unfold, he drank himself to death in 1939, he saw its seeds and recognized them for what they were. And I find these testimonies very strong, because it's easy when you know what the outcome is to say, well, this is how it led to that. So I think writers like him help us to look for the symptoms. Hannah Arendt is another one who helps us to look for the symptoms. His and her work, they are like premonitions. It's easy to be wise after the event. But wouldn't it be better if we heed the warnings before? So what conclusions do I draw from reading Roth and Hannah Arendt and many, many others? It tells me that the hatred of the big-time villains or the callous violence of their small-time followers is not the biggest threat to society. The biggest threat is the indifference of the majority. The ability of individuals to shrug off the warning signs and to leave evil unchallenged is the biggest threat. Because great evils don't just suddenly appear from the blue sky. They fester and grow when unchecked. It starts with a word dehumanizing someone because he's a Jew or a gypsy or a Muslim or gay. The boundaries of what is acceptable then are stretched Language once deemed coarse, inappropriate, and sometimes outright discriminatory undergoes a sort of inflation. We get callous, our souls get callous, and we get used to things that we didn't get used to before. I think if some people who lived in the 70s and 80s would wake up today and listen to political discourse, would be shocked as what has now become normal in political discourse in Europe again. So that's why I believe we cannot be complacent. We cannot simply shrug and hope it will pass like a fleeting breeze. We need to stand up and speak out and say no to hatred, say no to discrimination, say no to dehumanization. Because if we don't, words of hate that go unchecked will slowly but surely enable an environment where actions of hate can take place. And it could also lead to an environment where such actions will be shushed with there was violence on both sides. In sum, dear friends, let us therefore use our history to teach the next generation of Europeans where their freedoms came from. That is the value of what you are doing. How these freedoms hung in the balance. How their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents fought and were liberated. It did not go easily. It could have gone wrong. It went wrong. They went from Nazi occupation to communist oppression. And it took them decades to liberate themselves from that and to reunify Europe. Defeating the Nazi terror at the time was a heroic deed. But by learning the lessons of history, we give battle to the ideology that drove it. And let me be very clear. History is a teacher. History can be a museum. History is not a political instrument. And we politicians should be modest. Leave interpretation of history to historians. Quote them. Ask them questions. Teach our children well, but not instrumentalize history. By giving those boys a name, a face, and a history, that's when they will never die. By celebrating them as humans, and by bringing them back to life through memory and also showing their hopes and aspirations. So let us encourage old and young Europeans to travel the liberation route, to listen to the stories of our forebears on both sides, and to vow that together in Europe we will never again turn a blind eye if Europe's values are threatened and our fellow men and women are dehumanized. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an important project. I wish you good luck. I offer you my assistance and help if you need it. And I wish you a lot of success in this honorable endeavor. Thank you very much.